The frozen dawn of February 1943 broke over the Tunisian hills with a dull metallic light. In the distance, the ground trembled, not from artillery, but from the steady rhythmic thunder of engines. German troops of the Afrika Korps peered through the haze, expecting perhaps a small Allied column. Instead, over the ridge came a sight that left even veteran panzer crews silent. A long column of American M4 Sherman tanks rolled forward, their silhouettes identical, each one the same shape, the same speed, the same roar. It was not a handful of machines, but a river of steel. Through the dust, the black crosses on German armor faced a machine that symbolized something entirely new: the weaponization of industry itself. Unlike the handcrafted Tigers that needed weeks of assembly, these Shermans seemed infinite, built by the hour in factories half a world away. The German soldiers stared in disbelief. One officer muttered, "How many do they have?" No one answered, because even then, deep in that desert valley, they understood. This war would no longer be won by the few with brilliance, but by the many with machines. When America entered World War II in December 1941, it was not yet the world's arsenal. It was a nation reeling from shock, its Pacific Fleet burning at Pearl Harbor and its army still small and undersupplied. The U.S. had tanks, but not enough and not good enough. Its armored divisions trained with wooden mock-ups. Its production scattered among car plants unaccustomed to the relentless pace of wartime demand. Meanwhile, Germany's panzers had already conquered half of Europe, their armored spearheads crushing France in 6 weeks and driving deep into Russia. In those early days, American generals faced a stark realization. The United States could not outgun the Axis in the short term, but it could outbuild them. In the words of President Franklin D. Roosevelt, the solution lay not on the front lines but in the factories. In a 1940 fireside chat, he called upon the nation to become the arsenal of democracy. That phrase would become more than propaganda. It would become a blueprint for victory. The transformation began almost overnight. In the winter of 1941, Henry Ford, William Knudsen, and a small group of industrial engineers gathered in Detroit to solve a single problem: how to mass-produce tanks the way America had once mass-produced automobiles. The German Tiger tank, though formidable, required around 300,000 man-hours to build. The American Sherman would take a fraction of that time, because it was designed for assembly, not artistry. The M4 Sherman, named after Union General William Tecumseh Sherman, was never meant to be perfect. It was meant to be built. Its armor was moderate, its gun competent, its reliability unmatched. Every component was standardized so that parts from one tank could fit another anywhere in the world, a concept alien to German manufacturing, which prized precision over interchangeability. The Sherman's greatest weapon was not its cannon, but the supply chain that fed it. In 1942, the Detroit Arsenal tank plant, run by Chrysler, became the epicenter of this industrial revolution. Designed by Albert Kahn, the same architect who had built Ford's factories, the plant was an engineering marvel. Concrete floors stretched for acres. Cranes moved in constant rhythm. Thousands of workers, men and women alike, turned raw steel into tanks with the speed of a conveyor belt. At its peak, a new Sherman rolled off the line every 49 minutes. Across the city, Ford's Highland Park and Willow Run factories joined the effort, retooling automobile lines to produce engines, armor plates, and transmission systems. In a matter of months, America's automotive workforce became a mechanized army of builders. Rosie the Riveter hammered bolts beside returning veterans. Engineers worked through the night to solve production bottlenecks. The heartbeat of war echoed not from guns but from stamping presses and assembly lines. By the end of 1942, the first Shermans were reaching the front. They landed in North Africa under Operation Torch, where American forces joined their British allies against the seasoned Afrika Korps. It was here that the Sherman faced its first true test against the battle-hardened Panzer III and IV divisions commanded by General Erwin Rommel. At first, the results were mixed. The Sherman's 75mm gun could not easily penetrate heavier German armor, but its reliability astonished both sides. German tanks frequently broke down in the desert heat, their engines choking on sand. The Sherman, with its robust Continental R975 radial engine and simple maintenance design, kept moving. crews learned that if a tank was hit and disabled, it could often be repaired and returned to service within days. The Germans, observing this, began to notice something unsettling. For every tank they destroyed, another appeared within weeks, sometimes days. In Africa, they captured damaged Shermans and inspected them. What they found disturbed them further. Identical components, interchangeable parts, and engines that could be swapped with minimal effort. The efficiency was alien to a military that built its tanks almost by hand. By 1943, this industrial tempo reached full stride. America produced nearly 29,000 tanks that year alone, more than Germany had built in the entire war up to that point. The numbers were staggering. At one point, U.S. factories were producing more tanks in a month than Germany could in 6. The German High Command began to understand that the Allies' strength lay not only in the battlefield, but in the factories thousands of miles away. While German industry struggled under Allied bombing and resource shortages, America's production expanded relentlessly. Aluminum, steel, and rubber flowed through an unbroken logistical chain that spanned from Midwest mills to European ports. Detroit's skies glowed red at night from the furnaces. Railroad yards groaned under the weight of armored freight cars bound for the coast. Even in small towns, workers knew their shifts contributed directly to the war's outcome. Yet this explosion of production was not without cost. The Sherman, in its pursuit of efficiency, made compromises. Its armor was thinner than that of the German Tiger or Panther, its main gun less powerful. Critics, including American tank crews, often referred to it bitterly as a Ronson, after the cigarette lighter brand, because it lights up the first time it's hit. But to the generals, the math was unassailable. For every Tiger built, America could field 5 Shermans and keep them supplied, repaired, and fueled indefinitely. German tank commander Otto Carius later wrote, "We could destroy 10 of them and 10 more would appear." It was like trying to stop the ocean. That ocean was rising. By mid-1943, as Allied forces pushed deeper into Italy and prepared for the invasion of France, the full weight of American industrial power was becoming visible. Sherman variants rolled out with improved guns, thicker armor, and specialized roles. Recovery tanks, mine flail tanks, amphibious tanks. Every adaptation was made possible by the same principle: mass production and modular design. While the Wehrmacht struggled to replace its elite Tiger battalions, America's logistics networks ensured that every armored division had what it needed, when it needed it. A German Tiger tank might take 2 weeks to repair a broken transmission. A Sherman could have its engine replaced in a single afternoon. Back in Detroit, the production line never stopped. Factory whistles blew through the night. Workers in overalls moved in synchronized rhythm beneath the glare of industrial lamps. Each completed tank carried a small plaque, "Made in the USA," before being loaded onto trains and shipped to ports bound for Europe. The men who built them rarely saw combat, but they understood their purpose. In letters home, they described the work not as manufacturing, but as fighting with machines instead of rifles. In the great assembly halls of the arsenal of democracy, America had found a new kind of soldier, one who wielded a wrench instead of a weapon. By the time 1944 arrived, German intelligence was alarmed. Reports estimated that the Allies could field 5 to 6 times as many tanks as Germany. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights over England revealed vast staging grounds filled with row upon row of Shermans waiting to cross the Channel. For the Wehrmacht, the question was no longer how to defeat the Allied tanks, but whether they could ever destroy enough of them to matter. And soon, they would find out, on the beaches and hedgerows of France, where America's industrial war machine would face Germany's armored elite head-on. When the first waves of American armor rolled ashore in Normandy in June 1944, the German soldiers manning the hedgerows saw something they had not encountered before, a war machine that seemed endless. The M4 Shermans arrived in every shape and variant, some carrying infantry, others equipped with flamethrowers or bridges, others towing supplies through the mud. To the Germans watching from their bunkers, it appeared less like an army and more like an industrial tide. The Sherman was not a masterpiece of engineering. It was a masterpiece of practicality. American military planners had long abandoned the notion of building the perfect tank. Instead, they designed one that could be built, repaired, and improved without halting production. German tank designers, meanwhile, struggled under the weight of perfectionism. Every Tiger tank required hand-machined parts and meticulous assembly. Its 88mm gun was unmatched in range and accuracy, but the weapon's brilliance was its downfall. It demanded resources Germany no longer had. The Sherman's 75mm gun could not match its punch, but the Americans compensated with speed, quantity, and coordination. To the German tankers who faced them, this was shocking. They had been taught that the Tiger was a symbol of German superiority, that one Tiger could destroy 10 Shermans. And sometimes it could, but the problem was what happened afterward. For every Tiger that was destroyed, replaced, or even repaired, dozens of new Shermans arrived at the front. They came on ships, on trains, on trucks, until the ground itself seemed to hum with the weight of American steel. On the other side, inside those Shermans, the crews understood their machines' limitations. They knew that frontal engagements against Panthers or Tigers were suicide. But they also knew that they had the numbers, the mobility, and above all, the reliability to outlast. A Sherman could travel 100 miles without a breakdown, something few German tanks could do under combat conditions. In muddy French fields where German engines overheated or transmissions snapped, Shermans simply kept moving. The American strategy was built on integration. Tanks didn't fight alone. They worked alongside infantry, artillery, engineers, and air power in a combined arms doctrine that multiplied their effectiveness. When German tank crews spotted a column of Shermans, they often soon heard the roar of P-47 Thunderbolts overhead. The Americans didn't need to outgun the Germans. They simply surrounded them with overwhelming coordination. Yet even among the Germans, there was a reluctant respect for this efficiency. Wehrmacht reports from Normandy repeatedly mentioned unending streams of Shermans. Soldiers wrote of their disbelief, that even after annihilating entire Allied units, new ones appeared within days, their equipment untouched by the shortages that crippled German supply lines. The shock was not only military, it was psychological. The German soldier had been raised on the myth of technological superiority. The Panzer was his nation's pride, a symbol of precision and dominance. To see it overtaken by sheer volume, to see identical, mass-produced tanks roll forward without pause, was to witness the collapse of that illusion. Back home, the American industrial miracle continued to operate at full power. Women worked double shifts, mechanics retooled production lines overnight, and railways pulsed with shipments of armor and ammunition. The war effort had unified the country in a way unseen before or since. At the Detroit Arsenal, more than 22,000 tanks were produced between 1941 and 1945. In Chicago, Pittsburgh, and Cleveland, every steel mill, every foundry, every engine plant contributed. It wasn't just tanks, and it was a system. The Shermans that crossed the Channel were supported by a web of logistics that reached back to the American Midwest. Spare parts, fuel drums, ammunition crates, even replacement engines arrived faster than the front could consume them. The Germans, relying on horse-drawn transport and limited rail capacity, couldn't comprehend how the Allies maintained such relentless momentum. And then there was the human factor. The men who built these tanks were ordinary citizens, factory workers, farmers, mechanics, and students. Many of them had never seen a battlefield, but they understood that what they made could decide one. They worked by torchlight, sometimes sleeping beside the assembly line. When a new tank rolled out, workers would pause for a moment of silence, knowing it might soon be on a battlefield halfway across the world. For the Sherman crews, the tank became more than a machine. It was their lifeline. They personalized them with names like Thunderbolt, Fury, or Courageous Lady. They painted slogans on the hulls, carried Lucky Charms inside, and treated the tank's engine like a heart. Even knowing its vulnerabilities, they trusted it. Because unlike the German tankers, who often saw their complex machines fail mechanically, the Sherman crews knew theirs would start every morning. German officers began to note this difference. After the war, one recalled, they fought with machines we would have considered unworthy. But they never stopped coming, and that was worse than any Tiger. By late 1944, the contrast between the two industrial philosophies was visible everywhere. German factories, bombed nightly by Allied raids, could no longer sustain production. Even when Tigers or Panthers were completed, fuel shortages prevented their deployment. Meanwhile, in America, factories ran on triple shifts. Ford's Highland Park produced engines while Chrysler built hulls and General Motors supplied transmissions. Every part, from bolts to tracks, fit together seamlessly. Because they were all standardized, the German industry had become fragmented, its production decentralized and inefficient. Hitler's obsession with wonder weapons and massive tanks like the Maus and new prototypes diverted critical resources from what mattered most: quantity. The Americans had chosen the opposite path: reliability, interchangeability, and repairability. To the soldiers on the ground, this philosophy translated into survival. In the field, a Sherman's damaged suspension could be fixed using parts from another tank. Mechanics carried toolkits specifically designed to swap components quickly. German units, on the other hand, often had to abandon tanks simply because the right part wasn't available. Even within the Allied ranks, the Sherman's reputation evolved. British engineers converted them into Fireflies, rearmed with powerful 17-pounder guns that could pierce German armor. Canadian and Polish forces modified their Shermans for specialized tasks, from mine clearing to amphibious landings. The same base design was adapted across continents, proving its versatility. For the Germans, this adaptability was unnerving. The tank they had first dismissed as a crude American product was now appearing in every form imaginable: faster, lighter, stronger. Reports from the Eastern Front described Soviet Lend-Lease Shermans fighting alongside T-34s, a symbol of industrial unity among the Allies. In late 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, this difference reached its clearest expression. The German offensive struck hard and fast, catching the Allies off guard. Panzer divisions punched through the snow-covered forests of the Ardennes. But once again, logistics determined fate. The German tanks ran out of fuel. Their momentum collapsed. American repair crews restored damaged Shermans within days, and reinforcements arrived in waves. For every tank Germany lost, it could not replace it. For every Sherman destroyed, 2 more rolled out of an American ship at Antwerp. In letters recovered after the war, German soldiers described their despair. "It never ends," one wrote. "We destroy them in the morning, and by afternoon more appear. They are like a swarm that rebuilds itself." By the winter of 1945, as the Allies pushed into the Rhineland, the sight of Sherman columns advancing through ruined towns became common. They no longer symbolized just American engineering, they symbolized inevitability. The Germans could admire, hate, or fear them, but they could not stop them. And when the war finally reached Germany's heart, it was not the Tiger or Panther that filled the streets of Berlin. It was the Sherman, simple, rugged, and unstoppable. From the deserts of North Africa to the forests of France, the lesson was the same. The future of war would not belong to the few who built perfectly, but to the many who built enough. By the summer of 1944, the war in Europe had reached its pivotal phase. The Allies had landed in Normandy and were pressing inland. The German army, though still lethal, was beginning to fracture under the combined pressure of air power, artillery, and relentless logistics. And at the center of it all rolled the M4 Sherman, the symbol of America's industrial heart now turned into a weapon of momentum. The decisive confrontation came not in a single battle, but across thousands of small fields and towns, hedgerows, bridges, and crossroads where the Sherman met Germany's armored elite head-on. For the first time, Tiger tanks faced the true weight of Allied industry. In engagements like Villers-Bocage, Mortain, and Saint-Lô, the fields of France became graveyards of steel. German tankers still trusted their machines. The Tiger's 80 gun could destroy a Sherman from over a mile away. Its armor was nearly impenetrable from the front. But the Tiger's power came with cost. It was slow, heavy, and rare. Each Tiger required thousands of man-hours and precise materials to construct. Many broke down before reaching battle. Some ran out of fuel before even firing a shot. In contrast, Shermans poured into France at a rate that defied belief, ferried by Liberty ships, driven by fresh crews repaired overnight, and sent back into combat. In Normandy's Bocage country, the fighting was brutal. German tanks lay hidden behind hedgerows, waiting for unsuspecting Shermans to pass before firing point blank. The Allies suffered heavy losses, yet their advantage was persistence. Every destroyed Sherman was soon replaced. Crews adapted, learning to flank to coordinate with infantry and airstrikes. American tactical innovation, The fusion of armor, artillery, and air support began to outmatch even the Wehrmacht's experience. Then came Operation Cobra in late July 1944, the turning point that shattered the German line in Normandy. More than 3,000 Shermans massed along narrow French lanes, engines idling under clouds of dust and heat. Overhead, American bombers dropped a storm of explosives that tore open German defenses. When the dust settled, the Shermans surged forward, breaking through the remnants of Panzer Division. What followed was chaos. Columns of German vehicles caught on open roads, strafed by thunderbolts surrounded by armor on all sides. To the German soldiers, it seemed impossible, the speed, the coordination, the sheer number of tanks. They came from every direction, one Panzer Grenadier later wrote. We fired until the barrels glowed red. Still they came. By the time the Falaise pocket closed in August, tens of thousands of German troops were trapped, their tanks burning in fields now blackened with oil and smoke. Among the wreckage, Allied soldiers found abandoned Tigers and Panthers, machines too damaged or fuel-starved to escape. The technological marvels of Germany's industry had met their limit. The Sherman, less glamorous but unstoppable, had overrun them. What stunned the Germans most was not just the numbers, but the speed with which they reappeared. When reconnaissance reported hundreds of destroyed Allied tanks, within days new divisions arrived, their ranks refilled with fresh Shermans straight from the ports of Cherbourg and Le Havre. The German war machine, once feared for its precision, now faced an enemy it could not exhaust. By autumn 1944, as the Allies advanced through France and into Belgium, the pattern was unmistakable. The Sherman wasn't just a tank, it was an ecosystem. Maintenance crews followed every advance, salvaging damaged hulls, swapping parts, and returning vehicles to battle. Fuel convoys, truck columns, and railway lines kept the front alive. The American system of logistics, born in Detroit's assembly lines, was now the difference between victory and defeat. Even the Luftwaffe could no longer stem the tide. The skies were Allied territory, and every German movement risked exposure. For the first time, German generals began to admit privately that they could no longer match the pace of Allied replenishment. Our tanks die once, one wrote in despair. Theirs are reborn endlessly. In December 1944, however, Hitler made one last gamble. The Ardennes Offensive, better known as the Battle of the Bulge. More than 200,000 German troops and hundreds of tanks surged through the snow-covered forests of Belgium, catching the Allies off guard. In the early days, the offensive achieved startling success. Fog-grounded Allied aircraft and German panzers, led by King Tigers, drove deep into American lines. For a moment, it seemed as if Germany had regained its deadly rhythm. But then the weather cleared. The fog lifted. Allied aircraft returned to the skies, and with them came the Shermans in force. What had begun as a German breakout soon turned into a siege. At Bastogne, surrounded American forces held their ground with Sherman support until Patton's Third Army arrived. The German assault slowed, then faltered. Tanks ran dry of fuel, ammunition convoys were destroyed, and the once feared panzers were abandoned in the snow. Captured German officers were astonished at what they saw in the counterattack. Endless streams of Shermans advancing through winter blizzards, headlights glowing dimly through the frost, engines roaring in unison. For every Tiger destroyed, a dozen Shermans filled the gap. American repair crews restored damaged vehicles in frozen fields, using parts shipped from England or scavenged from wrecks. The psychological effect was immense. Wehrmacht soldiers, once confident in their technological superiority, now spoke of the Shermans as a force of nature. The myth of German invincibility had been replaced by the reality of Allied abundance. By spring 1945, as the Allies crossed the Rhine and pushed into the heart of Germany, the contrast between the two empires of production was absolute. German cities lay in ruins, their factories bombed to rubble. Fuel depots were empty, skilled workers had been drafted into the army. Meanwhile, American production still surged. In the final months of the war, U.S. factories were building tanks faster than the army could deploy them. Columns of Shermans advanced through shattered towns. Cologne, Remagen and Essen greeted not by enemy fire, but by civilians surrendering in silence. The tanks moved like clockwork, their tracks grinding across bridges and rubble. They were no longer fighting a war of survival, but completing an inevitability. For the German troops who remained, the sight of those tanks rolling through their homeland was a humbling realization. They had believed themselves the masters of mechanized warfare. But in the end, it was the simple mass-produced Sherman, the tank they had once mocked, that conquered them. By May 1945, when Germany surrendered, more than 49,000 Shermans had been built. They had fought across every front: North Africa, Italy, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Germany itself. Some even served in the Pacific, against Japan's fortifications. They had become not only a weapon but a symbol of how America fought. Through unity, production, and relentless adaptation. The Sherman had no mythic aura, no perfection in design, but it embodied something far greater: the industrial democracy that powered it. While the Tiger represented the pinnacle of craftsmanship, the Sherman represented the triumph of system, organization, and will. The Germans, watching their cities fall and their tanks burn, understood this truth too late. They had lost not just a war, but a race of efficiency, one waged in factories, foundries, and the quiet determination of workers thousands of miles from the front. And as the smoke cleared over the ruins of Europe, the clatter of Sherman tracks faded into history. The sound of a machine that had turned the tide not through brilliance, but through the unyielding rhythm of production. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, Europe was in ruins. Cities lay shattered, bridges collapsed, and farmlands turned to mud. But amid the destruction, one unmistakable shape remained in almost every photograph of victory: the M4 Sherman. It stood in the streets of Berlin beside Red Army tanks, in the fields of Normandy, where it had broken through hedgerows, and on the docks of Antwerp, still coated in the dust of long campaigns. The Sherman had become more than just a tool of war. It was the symbol of an industrial civilization that had transformed itself into a weapon of survival. For the Germans, defeat brought not only military collapse but a sobering recognition of how they had been outmatched. Their Tiger and Panther tanks, once feared for their power, were now monuments to inefficiency. A Tiger took roughly 300,000 labor hours to build. A Sherman required barely 30,000. Germany had bet on superiority. America had bet on sustainability. And in the long war of attrition, it was the latter that prevailed. Captured German engineers studied the American production system with disbelief. They examined assembly lines where hundreds of tanks could be built in the time it took them to finish one. They saw that the Shermans used standardized parts: bolts, tracks, gears, identical across factories, making repairs seamless and production modular. The Germans had treated every tank as a custom masterpiece. The Americans treated them as replaceable instruments of a larger machine. General Heinz Guderian, one of Germany's most brilliant tank strategists, later admitted that the war was lost not on the battlefield but in the factories. The enemy fought with time, he said, and time was built into every tank they made. Across the Atlantic, the Detroit Arsenal tank plant stood silent for the first time in years. The workers who had labored without pause through the darkest days of the war now watched as production lines slowed to a stop. Some wept as the last Sherman rolled out under the giant steel arches. In 4 years, they had built an army without leaving home. Over 22,000 tanks had come from that single plant. Each bore the imprint of the same hands: welders, riveters, machinists, who had turned steel into salvation. In the Pacific, Shermans had played their own role in victory. While Japanese tanks were often outclassed and lightly armored, it was the Sherman's versatility that made it invaluable. On Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, modified Shermans fitted with flamethrowers burned through fortified tunnels and caves. Their presence gave infantry the protection and firepower needed to advance under horrific conditions. When American troops finally landed in Japan after the surrender, the sight of Sherman tanks rolling through quiet streets shocked Japanese citizens who had been told that their enemies were technologically inferior. But Europe was where the Sherman's legacy truly lived and where its moral contrast was clearest. In occupied Germany, Allied officers often showed captured civilians the immense photographic records of American factories. They wanted them to understand how it had happened, how a nation that had once been isolationist had transformed its car plants into a war machine. For many Germans, it was incomprehensible. The same democracy that they had dismissed as soft and decadent had produced a system so disciplined, so efficient that it overwhelmed the Reich's command economy. And yet, The Sherman was not loved by all who served in it. Many American tankers remembered the friends they lost inside its steel hull. They remembered the fires, the explosions, the moments when they realized their armor was too thin against a tiger's shell. In interviews decades later, veterans often spoke of the Sherman with both affection and bitterness. It had carried them through hell, but it had also failed them at times. Still, historians would later argue that the Sherman's very imperfections were what made it victorious. It was not designed to dominate in single combat, but to endure as part of a system. When paired with artillery, infantry, and air support, the Sherman was unstoppable. It embodied the Allied doctrine of cooperation, the idea that no machine or soldier fought alone. As post-war studies were conducted, the numbers told the story with brutal clarity. The United States had produced nearly 50,000 Shermans, while Germany had managed fewer than 1,500 Tigers and around 6,000 Panthers. Even if every German tank had been superior, and many were, they were simply too few to stem the tide. The Sherman's greatest victory was not on the battlefield but in proving that quantity, when combined with coordination and reliability, could defeat technical superiority. After the war, thousands of Shermans were shipped across the world to rebuild armies shattered by years of conflict. Britain, France, Poland, Israel, and even the Soviet Union received them. Some were refitted with new guns and engines. Others were used for training. In Israel, the Sherman fought again during the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, this time as a weapon of a newborn nation. Decades later, modified Shermans would still see combat in conflicts from Korea to the Middle East. The same tank that had rolled off
American assembly lines in 1942 would still be
firing shells into the 1970s. But, for the Americans who built and fought in them, the tank's legacy was more personal. Veterans returned home to a changed country, one that had proven what unity and purpose could accomplish. The arsenal of democracy had not only built machines but reshaped society. Women who had worked in factories found new independence. Industrial capacity, once dedicated to war, now produced cars, homes, and infrastructure. The same assembly lines that had forged tanks would build the consumer world of the 1950s. For the Germans, the post-war years brought introspection. Engineers who had once built the Tiger and Panther were recruited by other nations, including the United States and the Soviet Union. They carried their expertise into the next generation of armored warfare, but many admitted privately that they had misunderstood the future. Perfection, they realized, could not defeat practicality. The Tiger had been a weapon of fear. The Sherman, a weapon of endurance. Historians studying German war records discovered letters from tank crews who had fought in Normandy, describing their disbelief at the endless American reinforcements. "We destroyed them all morning," one wrote, "and by afternoon there were more. They fight with steel and patience." Another simply wrote, "They do not stop." In time, the Sherman came to symbolize not only America's industrial might but its philosophy of warfare. That strength lay in systems, not singular machines. The war had proven that victory in the 20th century would belong to the nation that could sustain conflict, not merely win battles. The irony was not lost on post-war analysts. Germany, the birthplace of modern industrial engineering, had been defeated by a nation that used its own principles better. Where Germany had built masterpieces, America had built mechanisms. Where Germany sought perfection, America sought scale. And in that contrast lay the true legacy of the Sherman. Not the tank itself, but the idea it represented. That in an age of mechanized war, adaptability would outweigh precision, and endurance would outlast genius. As Europe began to rebuild, Shermans were melted down or left in fields to rust. Children climbed on them, unaware that the machines beneath their feet had once decided the fate of nations. Yet in the silence of post-war reconstruction, the lessons endured. The sound of the Sherman's engine had faded, but its rhythm still echoed in the factories and foundries that followed. A reminder that wars are not only fought with weapons, but with will, organization, and the hands of countless unseen builders. And from those lessons emerged the future of warfare, one defined not by glory or grandeur, but by the quiet, steady hum of production lines that could shape the course of history. In the quiet years that followed the war, the Sherman story faded from glory into memory, The world moved on. Jet engines roared over new skies, atomic power defined strategy, and nations rebuilt from the ruins. Yet deep within that industrial echo, the Sherman's legacy remained. Not as a symbol of perfection, but of possibility. It was a machine born of practicality and perseverance. It did not dazzle with innovation nor inspire awe through fear. It won through constancy, through the strength of ordinary workers who never stopped believing that effort, multiplied 1,000,000 times, could change the course of history. Every tank that rolled from the factory floor was a testament to that belief. The German engineers had built marvels of precision. The Americans had built miracles of endurance. One fought with pride, the other with patience. And when history tallied the outcome, it was patience, industrial, logistical, and human, that had prevailed. In that sense, the Sherman's victory was not only mechanical, but moral. It reflected a society that valued cooperation over hierarchy, adaptability over arrogance. It proved that greatness in war need not come from the pursuit of perfection, but from the power of the collective, of thousands of men and women working together for something larger than themselves. Today, when historians look back on the war, they see the Sherman not as a relic of steel, but as a reflection of an era that understood endurance as its greatest weapon. Its tracks may have rusted, its armor long melted down, but its true legacy endures. In every lesson of industrial resolve, in every story of resilience against impossible odds. Because in the end, the Sherman was never just a tank. It was a rhythm, the hum of an assembly line, the roar of an engine crossing a foreign field, the steady heartbeat of a nation that learned how to turn unity into victory. And that rhythm, more than any shell or gun, was what finally brought the war to its end.